something that very well mark you as not only an ambassador, to have one up on me. And I would do everything I could to distract you. Now, you going to allow yourself, I'm asking you that question. Are you going to allow distraction to hinder you today? I guess the rest of you are, right? I want to ask you again, you don't have to be distracted. To hear from the King. Hallelujah.
Amen. Praise his name. Hallelujah. How many of you really meant those words that you just sang? As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. You know, you really don't appreciate being thirsty until the water's cut off. Am I right? As long as it's readily accessible and you've been drinking on it, you can get it whenever you want. You don't have a longing for it. But I found that it's when it begins to be cut off, you begin to see that it's getting short in supply, and all of a sudden you realize, I may not always have access to this. I may not always be able to come and glean what I want when I want. Then all of a sudden it begins to create this sense of longing, doesn't it? Now you begin to understand this. Now you begin to understand that I have to have this. It's necessary for me. I can't go on without it. My soul begins to long for him, just as the words of that song is, the deer longs for the water. I found that it was really fitting because this week, as I began to study this week's Torah portion, it seemed like everything that could hinder would happen. Every time I would sit down to try to study, things would be going on, things to distract, things to cause me to not be able to concentrate. It was one after another, and I was getting aggravated. And I was getting frustrated. And I was having to deal with my own flesh at that point because I was just frustrated. And then I remember, just as that song sings, what's the purpose of this? We're here because we're trying to hear from him. We're trying to listen. And then I realized, I got to deal with this one first. I can't properly hear. I can't blame it on all these other distractions around me. I can't blame it on these things that are happening. I have to deal with this one right here. And if I can get this one in line, if I can train out, ignore it. You can't change any of that, but you can change this right here. You can change your sit down. You can actually begin to get with your flesh, right? It's not something that's not apply to you. But I got news for you. And I found out that, if this is something that I'm having such a hindrance in getting, then maybe, just maybe, it must be important. I must really need this. If there is this much happening to keep me from getting this, my goodness, this has got to be life-changing. And so by the end of the week, you know what? I'm going to allow anything to keep me from hearing what he has to say because I want to know. I got to have it. I can't go on. So I want you to do me a favor. David's already trained you to say that you're not going to be a distraction and that you're not going to be distracted. But I want you to take your finger and I want you to place it right here on your own chest and say, flesh, I am going to hear. Amen. Now, sometimes we can be unruly and we don't really want to listen. So if you happen to today get in this position where it's listen, it don't want to listen, just do yourself a favor and just get a hold of that neck right there. And if you mean business, and if your flesh knows you're serious and you ain't gonna put up with it, I'll guarantee you'll be able to hear, won't you? Sometimes you just gotta let your flesh know who's boss and who means business. Amen. We're gonna look at today's Torah portion. And with my Southern Hebrew accent, I will probably butcher the name of this portion. It is titled Bechukotai. The English is in My Statutes. And it was a really interesting portion because if you follow on the Parsha cycle, you'll realize that it's the last one in the book of Leviticus. It closes out this book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and he called. Literally say that this is the final marching orders for the ones that he has called. This is the last message for the one that he's chosen and called to be his people, the ones that have been called out from among the nations. And so I find then that before we go forward and begin to walk this out, this ought to be a really important message, shouldn't it? This is what he saves for the end, his final message to those that he's calling out to. And when I begin to look at this Torah portion, it covers Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3, through chapter 27, verse 34, by the way. I realize that after a long list of commandments, how many of you have made it through Leviticus? You realize one commandment, at least one of our least favorite, isn't it? Because it's one and after another. And so that's where our flesh comes into play. Do we really have to do all of this? Is this really important? Is this something I really need to know? And by the end of the book, we find that we're dragging through it. I'm almost at the end. And at the end, what does Yahweh do? Instead of finishing up with some commandments like, oh, these are really important, focus on these, I found that instead he finishes with an explanation. If you've made it this far, and you're being committed to do, and we can understand that sometimes if we're in our flesh, it can be a drudgery. It can be something that we're wondering, why in the world do we need all of this? Why is this important? I found that at the end, he explains why we need this. He explains why it's important. He ends the book of Leviticus of how either our obedience or our disobedience to these statutes, to these commandments that he's just spent all this time sharing with us, how it's going to affect us as an individual, as a community, and as a nation, as a whole. He begins to explain to them that the reason you've heard all this is because now what you do with it, what you do with my words, it's either going to cause you to walk in the blessings of your disobedience will cause you to walk in the curses that are also available to you and I. And I found that the list of blessings was a lot shorter than the list of curses, wasn't it? And that was interesting to me. And I found that the level of curses seems to increase. The more disobedient we are, and the whole time he continues to increase it. And he reminds us the reason this happens is it's for the express purpose of you getting back on the. This is all about you being on the right path, being in covenant. The blessings are your reward, your reminder, get back in the path, get back on track. And as I begin to look at this, some questions begin to pop up in my mind. Look at the blessings that are listed. These blessings are covering every area of your life, aren't they? It's providing for every need you might have, whether it be financial, whether it be healing, whether it be protection, whether it be peace in your home. These blessings begin to cover every single area. And as we've already mentioned, Chad was talking about this, when we look around us, our situation can sometimes seem bleak, can't it? The world around us seems like it's on a steady decline. In fact, it's doing everything opposite of what Yahweh says that he'll bless. And so we know, if we look at this, it's obvious that judgment's coming, right? If he doesn't judge, then his word isn't true. And so we find then that if we're living in a nation that's doing everything that they can to curse Yahweh and invoke his judgment upon us, where does that leave you and I? Does that leave us helpless? Does that leave us just caught up in the midst of the storm to be swept away with everyone else? Or is there a reason that he's telling us, if you walk in my commandments, if you keep my statutes, if you guard them, that even in the midst of whatever might be going on around us, no matter what type of calamity, disasters may come your way, no matter what type of judgment he pours out, that if we're one that's been walking in the commandments, if we're one that's been obedient, that even in the midst of all this, all of a sudden, these verses, these commandments, these words, what do they become? They become our provision. They become our protection. They become what will sustain you in the midst of the storm. Well, let's look at this a little bit closer and see, is this really what this is about? Is he revealing to you and I a safe haven, a place of protection in the midst of the storm, that if we'll be obedient now to begin to walk this out, if we'll be obedient now to put this in, that in the days ahead, we can trust in him and know that he's much more than able. If you have your scriptures, turn with me to Leviticus chapter 26, 3. This is the start of the Torah portion. And it starts off with a very small word, but it has a lot of meaning, doesn't it? And it's the word if. It all depends on us. If we do this, or if we don't. He says, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them. And you have to stop right there. This is what's going to enable you to go further. If we don't get this right, then we really don't need to read the rest, right? Because if we don't do this, we're not going to experience what follows this verse. We find that after he makes this statement, he then tells you, then I will give you in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And your threshing shall reach unto the vintage, and the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time, and you shall eat your bread to the full, and you shall dwell in your land in safety. And you find that as you continue to go on, he begins to tell you that not only are you going to dwell and be provided for, but you're going to be protected. You're going to be able to put 10,000 to flight. And you find that he provides all kinds of provision to be secure and to be at peace and to be provided for. And yet, it's only going to happen if we fulfill the first verse. If you walk in my statutes, if you keep my commandments and do them. This verse then becomes very important, doesn't it? Because it seems in that as we face these coming calamities, when we face these coming disasters, we're going to need some provision, right? We're going to need some supernatural force to make sure that we make it through, to carry us through the coming days. We find that this will only happen if we understand what it means to walk in his commandments. So we really need to look at this verse then, don't we? Because it's quite important. Let's look at the word if. It's the first word of this verse in the Hebrew. It's Strong's number 518. It's the word im, and it means if. It's oath context. In other words, this is covenant language that's happening here. He's initiating a covenant with the children of Israel. If you do this, I'll do this. If you do this, then I'm going to do this. We find, though, that when we break down this word, though, notice that it's spelled very similar to the word im for mother. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at this, but it's important. We need to understand because this is all part of walking in the commandments. The word im means mother, and it infers an individual that has a womb, someone that's a vessel, a container for seed. And it also infers that not only was she a container, a vessel for seed, she wombed the seed, but it also means there was a birth that took place, right? Some fruit was produced. And so when we see this, this is the first word that's about to describe how we walk in the commandments, how we keep the statutes, how we access the blessings. We find that the first thing that seems to be inferring to the children of Israel and to you and I is that we're being asked if we would be a vessel that would house his seed. He's presenting you the opportunity to be one that would carry the covenant, that would womb his word and produce its fruit. In fact, when you begin to look at this, it seems then that the whole focus is that whatever we're putting on in the inside of us, whether it's his word or something else, the fruit then becomes either the blessed fruit or the cursed fruit. Our actions, what we're putting on inside of us, then begins to produce fruit. We walk in the blessings because we're producing the good fruit, or we walk in the curses because we're producing the wrong fruit. When you break it apart, it's spelled with the aleph and the mem. The aleph is a prefix. It means I will. It's mem, which represents waters, but this mem is also connected to the idea of judgment. And it's because it's a closed mem. It's representing something that's hidden, something that's concealed. And so when we read this opening statement, it actually reveals that Yahweh will judge us and pour out his blessings or either his curses based upon what we have chosen to place within us. Whether we're willing to carry his covenant, his word, his Torah, his commandments, or not. He's looking at what we've hidden within our heart. And it's because it's easy to say with our mouths All that you said, we will do. Much like the children of Israel, without even thinking, wait, now I have to actually walk this out. And so we find that what is being emphasized here is that he's going to inspect the fruit of the house. He's going to inspect what we've chosen to place within the vessel. And it's during this inspection that this then determines whether we're one that's walking in the commandments, keeping the statutes, or one that has failed to do this. And this then determines whether we walk in the blessings or the curses. As I continue to look at this, I begin to think, well, there's many in the house that are struggling. The majority of us, to be quite honest, aren't walking in the blessings that are listed here, are we? I know I'm not. There's different areas we seem to be struggling with, a battle that's taking place. And at first glance, you may think, well, my goodness, have I failed to walk in the commandments? Have I failed to put his word in? And then, of course, there's always your neighbor that will be quick to say, there's sin in your life. That's why you're going through this. That's why you're dealing with these things. You need to get the sin out. And yet, I believe if you'll stop and begin to examine this a little closer, you're going to see things in a different perspective. You're going to see that walking this thing out and going through the refining process is all part of it. There may be another explanation of why we're struggling. There may be of why we're being tested and tried. And it has everything to do with the fact that he's actually showing us how to fulfill this verse. It's not that we fail to, it's that you're in the process of it. And that makes a big difference, doesn't it? Now we find that as this verse unfolds, it seems there's three actions that define what it means to be one who carries the covenant, what it means to be one that would wound his word, have his commandments inside of him, his word in their vessel. We're told to walk, to keep, and to do. Now in the English, that seems very similar. If I'm walking, keeping, and doing, okay, we're doing this. And it doesn't really explain to us exactly how to do this. But when we break it down in the Hebrew, you'll find that each of these words is very distinct. Each of the words is showing you in a very specific manner what he expects from you and I when he says, walk, keep, and do this. Let's look at the first one, walk. Walk in my commandments. In the Hebrew, Strong's number 3212, yalak, and it means to go, to walk, or to come. It's from the root halak, which also means to go, walk, or come. But it also can mean to be conversant with. And in fact, when you begin to look at this, is the term that's used to describe the relationship between Adam and Yahweh, and would come and halak, he'd walk and be conversant with Adam. It's describing an intimate relationship. They knew talking, speaking, a face-to-face encounter with one another. This term halak can also be used to speak of the pathways or the behavior of one's life. In other words, it's reminding us that it can be easy that when we appear on Shabbat service and we arrive to act super spiritual, right? To act like we've been walking this out and to put on this good act. And yet he's reminding you what I'm really interested in, what I'm inspecting, how you're acting when anyone's looking at you, but your behavior, your pathways of your life, what you're doing when no one's watching, what you're doing when the microscope isn't focused in and honed in on you. What's your behavior? What's your walk like? Your day-to-day life. Are we being conversant with him? Do we have a halakha with him? The emphasis becomes on the fact that this isn't a casual relationship. If I show up once a week, how well do I know you? If I don't spend any time with you outside of this, not very well. I may know your name. I know what you look like. I can probably spot you out in a crowd. But do I really know what you like? Do I know your likes, your dislikes? Do I know your personality? Do I really know you? And we find that this becomes the emphasis as Yahweh begins to tell us, walk in my commandments. He's emphasizing the fact, have a relationship with me. Spend time with me. Begin to know me, and we can begin to walk this out. In fact, this term halak, Strong's number 1980, it's a cognate of the word halak, Strong's number 1983. They're spelled the exact same way. The only difference is the vowel points change. And it means a toll, a custom, a tribute. Now, the definition of a tribute is wealth that one party gives to another as a sign of respect, as a sign of submission, as a sign of allegiance. And so we find that when he tells you, walk in my commandments, the emphasis is here that what's being asked of you and I is offer yourself as a tribute. Offer this offering to me as a sign that you're willing to submit, to be allegiant to me, to be in submission to me. Offer this as the sacrifice. And if you will offer this as the sacrifice, then we can have this halakha with one another. It's interesting because it also seems to reveal then whatever we are putting in, whether we're putting effort and time into our relationship with him, or whether we're putting effort and time into something else, our halakha, our walk, our behavior, it's exposing, it's revealing exactly who we're offering ourselves to. We find that if we're obedient to put his word in, to walk this out, to be in a relationship with him, it shows that we're offering him our respect, we're submitting ourselves to him. But when we fail to do that, if it's just a casual relationship that we've developed, and we're really busy spending our time elsewhere, then that as well is showing we're offering a tribute. We're submitting ourselves to something, to someone. We're offering our allegiance to someone else. And so he begins to remind us what is hidden in our heart, begins to show exactly who we're walking with, who we're offering as the king of our own lives. Now let's look at this word for keep. He says, walk in my commandments and keep them. The word keep here in Hebrew is shamar, and it means to keep, to guard, to observe, to give heed, but it can mean to stay within the bounds. And I thought that was quite interesting because sometimes when we become Torah beginning, right? Keep the commandments is to walk the tightrope. Am I right? It's very, very strict. One wrong move and you fall right off, and now you're done. You're over. And yet we find that the idea of to keep the commandments, it's boundary lines. Well, do you realize that means there's some room? It's encompassing a section. There's some boundary lines. Stay with boundary lines as you're walking this out. Well, let's look at these boundary lines that he's referring to. Shamar is spelled Shin, Mem, Resh. The letter Shin is the letter that represents fire, something that purges, purifies, it refines, it cleanses you. It removes the dross, the impurities. This is connected to the letter Mem. Earlier, we already looked at the fact that the Mem represented waters, but it could also be connected to judgment. So we have the fact that judges. And finally, on the end of this word, we have the letter Resh, which represents the head. Well, what's in your head? Your mind, hopefully, right? If I only had a brain. The head, the mind. And so we find that this word to keep, to shamar, the word picture that's literally being painted, what he's trying to share with the children of Israel is that if you'll keep my commandments, if you'll stay within the boundary lines that have been marked for you, that I just spent a whole book explaining to you, making sure that you knew the boundary lines have been made very clear, then we find that the judgments of Yahweh, instead of being something that's burdensome, instead of being something that's too difficult, instead of being something that's upon us, we find that our perspective changes. These judgments, these boundary lines become something that refine us. They purify us. They purge us. They our minds. I found that there's usually two ways that we'll respond when we're pressed, when you're being put into the tight squeeze, you're between the rock and the hard place. You'll either respond for the better. It'll make you stronger. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You'll be one that comes out more mature. You've learned some lessons, and now you can go on and begin to learn the next lesson. But there's also another way we have a tendency to respond when we're pressed, when we're squeezed, when we're being put in the fire. And that is that we can begin to murmur, to complain, to become stiff-necked and rebellious. We plant our feet in, and we refuse to learn the lessons. And yet he's reminding you that if you're one that's in the boundary lines, if you're one that's choosing to shamar, to keep these commandments, then no matter what you're facing, no matter what situation you're being pressed and squeezed in, then as you go through this, you can understand and your mind can be renewed that I'm being purified. I'm being refined. My vessel's being cleansed. I'm becoming more capable of being one that would womb his word, carry the covenant, carry his seed. And you can begin to look at these situations a little differently. Because I'm being tested, I'm being purged, but I can know for a fact, I can have faith in the fact that this covenant, there's a provision for me. That no matter if I'm going through a struggle right now in my body, maybe your health being attacked, and you're struggling and you're wondering, Yahweh, what's going on? Well, you can begin to look at this a little differently. We can understand that it's a refining process. You're being purged. This vessel is being refined and made pure. And in the midst of all this, you can understand that you're going to get through the struggle because there's a provision for your healing in this covenant. If it's a financial problem, you can understand, it looks bleak. I don't know where it's coming from or how I'm going to make it through, but I understand that I'm being refined. You're purging me, you're purifying me, and I understand that in this covenant, there's provision for me to be taken care of. And your faith begins to grow. You see, it's all about changing your mind, renewing it. So often we look at these situations, I'm going through some stuff and I'm not walking in the blessings. And we begin to complain and we begin to murmur, but he's reminding you, you're going through these things because this is what is teaching you to keep the commandments. We don't know what it means to walk it out in the easy times. It takes the fire to make us understand what it means to walk this out. In fact, we find that when you look at this word shamar, it has a 2-letter root on the end, the memration. It means bitterness, rebellion. It's connected to that sheen, which remember, it means to refine, to purify, to cleanse something. And so we see this word shamar, he's reminding that if you'll keep the judgments, it is going to purify and remove all that rebellion from out of you. It's going to remove the bitterness. It's going to change you. That's why it seems a lot of times when we get pressed and squeezed, a lot of ugly stuff comes out, doesn't it? We'll say, thank you. It's doing its job. It's getting it out. If I don't get it out, that means it's still in here. It needs to come out. And I found that once all of this comes out and then we put some good in, the next time I'm squeezed and pressed, it's a little bit better offering, isn't it? That's the whole point. The offering continually is refined, is continually purified, is continually made to be more fit for the great King. And so we find then that if we happen to be an individual that's constantly rebellious, is constantly bitter, is constantly murmuring and complaining, then we have to ask ourselves, are we really actually walking the commandment keeper? Because the literal definition here, to be one that keeps it, to be one that shamars it, means that we're allowing Yahweh to do this. It means that we're allowing him to remove this. We're allowing him to change our minds and renew us. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 26, the Apostle Paul says it this way, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word. The only way is by walking it out. So we have to ask the question, then, could then that we've been going through, it's not about us not being blessed, but it's about us being refined. It's about us being prepared so that when he does rain out the blessings, we can be one that accepts it and is ready for it, because we've learned what it means to trust him in the difficult times. Let's look at the word do. Walk it, keep it, and do it. The word do is Strong's number 6213, asa, and it means to do, to fashion, to accomplish, to make. But notice this, it can also mean to press or to squeeze. In other words, you don't ever get away from it. It's a constant refining. It's a constant pressing. It's a constant squeezing that we go through as we walk this out. And the interesting thing is that this word asa can refer to preparing a sacrifice to be offered to Yahweh. The reason he gives us these commandments, this covenant that we're walking out, is for this purpose right here. It's to prepare a sacrifice that's going to be offered to the great King. Can't just offer anything with all the blemishes, with all the issues. Instead, he gives us these commandments to begin to walk out. And as we walk it out, all of a sudden, this offering's becoming prepared. This offering's getting purified and refined, and we can offer him what the great King deserves, a tribute that he's worthy of. As we continue to look at this, we find that Romans chapter 12, verse 1 teaches the same thing. It tells you, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of Yahweh, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto Elohim, which is your reasonable service. The funny thing is, he describes it as your reasonable service. A lot of times when we actually do attempt to allow him to purify and refine us, we think, man, I'm good. I did great. I'm way ahead, ain't I? And yet he's reminding us, this is the least you can do. This is what's expected of you and I. This is the norm. This should be the norm, that each of us is walking as a living sacrifice, presenting our bodies. We find then that this is directly connected to how we handle the commandments, isn't it? How we handle his law, how we handle his word is affecting the type of offering we're presenting. It's affecting the tribute that we bring to him because it affects this vessel. We find that if we're willing to carry it and walk in it, his word becomes something that purges and refines us, and it enables us to offer a proper sacrifice. But if we're one that's not willing to put it in, if we're not handling it correctly, then this offering may or may not be acceptable. We find that it presses and it squeezes. Some of you may still be wondering, why is it so important, though, that we have to go through this? Why is the emphasis here on this process of refining? And remember, this is before you get to the blessings. We don't access the blessings until we go through the purification, through the refining. Why is this the method that he chooses? Well, let's look a little bit further. The first blessing that he mentions, so in other words, if you make it through this and you're still walking, if you make it through the purging and the refining and you're still obedient and you're choosing to be one that's still going to keep this, the first blessing that he says is that I will give you rain in due season. Well, let's look at this word for rain. It's Strong's number 1653, geshem, and it means rain or shower. The interesting thing, though, is that when you read throughout the scriptures, rain can be used as either a blessing or a curse. We find that rain is both used as a blessing and as a form of destruction. Rain is what brings life. It causes the crops to grow. He is the living water. And yet rain can also be a form of destruction. Noah's flood, the bitter waters, the waters that judge, the waters that destroy. Could it be then that it all depends on where we stand in connection with this covenant? Could it be then that it's only by walking it out, keeping and doing these commandments, renewing our mind, that then we can finally begin to see these are the blessings? Notice that this term geshem, rain, it's spelled the same way as another word, which means body. It's Strong's number 1655, geshem, and it's used only in the book of Daniel. And it's in a really interesting passage that ties in quite well with this whole idea of being one that would walk out the covenant. It's used in the book of Daniel, the unscathed bodies of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they emerge from the fiery furnace. We find then that if this is a connection here that he's been giving us, that if we're walking, keeping, and doing, it seems as if he's pointing to the fact that these statutes, if we're keeping them, if we're allowing his word to be a cleansing fire, offering ourselves as a tribute, then even when you're thrown into the fiery furnace, even when you're in the midst of calamity and disaster, you too can emerge unscathed. You too can come out like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why? Because the fire of his word has already purified this vessel. And so when you're thrown into this fire of persecution, that's nothing. I've been walking this out. He's been purifying. He's been refining. He's been purifying me. And we find that now we can understand that when we go through these things, there's a fourth man in the fire. It's okay. We can emerge out of this. We're going to be all right. Amen. And now we can begin to understand this is why this daily process of refining and pressing is needed. It teaches us to trust him, doesn't it? We find that if we've developed this relationship of trust, then when we're put into the furnace, we won't be one that's compromised or succumbs to the situation. Instead, we can proclaim boldly, just like they did, I know that my God is much more than able. And whether he delivers me or he chooses not to deliver me, I am not going to bow my knee. I won't offer a tribute to you. This offering is only for the great king. In fact, Daniel chapter 3, verse 27, this is the way it describes what was taking place. It says, "And the princes, the governors, and the captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them." I want to look at that word power, because it was interesting to me that the way they described this, the fire had no power over these individuals. The word power there is Strong's number 7981, Shalet, and it means to have power, to rule, to domineer, to have dominion over, to master. The fire could not master them. It could not have dominion over them. It could not have power over them. But the roots of this word are where things begin to get really interesting, because it explains why the fire had no power over them. We see two roots in this word, the Shin Lamed and the Lamed Tet. The Shin Lamed is a two-letter root which means a grievous sin, one that's worthy of death. In fact, it's used only to describe Uzzah, who in the time of King David mishandled the Ark of the Covenant. It was a grievous sin. This word right here. He mishandled Yahweh. He touched the Ark when he had no business touching the Ark. It was a grievous sin worthy of death. The second part of this word is the Lamed Tet. It's the root of the word or the name Lot. It represents a covering, specifically a fleshly covering. So we find that the roots of this word for power, it literally could define the fact that the fire, the calamity, the pressing, the squeezing, whatever it is that you're going through would have power and rule over you if you were one that was guilty of mishandling Yahweh in your flesh. We find in that the fire and the coming disasters on the horizons were being told here, it seems in the Hebrew, that it will only master and rule over those who have mishandled the presence of Yahweh. Those who have attempted to walk in their flesh and have not allowed his purging fire to change them into a fit sacrifice will be the ones that will be dominated by the situations, by the calamities, by the disasters, by the fire of persecution. It's these individuals that won't understand how to trust him. They won't understand there's a fourth man in the fire, and they'll be overwhelmed by their circumstances because they never learned how to be a vessel. They never learned how to properly handle him. They never learned what it meant to bring a tribute to the great king. But we find that if we're one like Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, like Daniel, when we're thrown into the lion's den, when we're thrown into the fiery furnace, then we can be one that emerges. It doesn't rule over us because we've been refined. We haven't mishandled him. Let's look at this word for statutes. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments. The word statutes is where we get the name of this Torah portion. It's Strong's number 2708. The root of it is hukah. And it means a statute, an ordinance, a limit, something that's been prescribed. It's from the root which means to cut out, to decree, to inscribe something, to set, to engrave, to portray, to govern. It has the sense of the fact that these statutes, these commandments that he's giving us, they're meant to be engraved upon us. They're meant to be inscribed. They need to be written upon our hearts. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the numerical value of this word, hukah, it has a value of 113. That's the same value as another word in Hebrew, makaseh, which means a refuge, a shelter. It's from the root meaning to flee for protection, to seek refuge in, to put one's hope and trust in. Could it be that it's his statutes, it's his Torah, it's his word that becomes a refuge and a shelter in times of calamity? Could that be what he's actually emphasizing here? Could that be why it's so important that we would be a vessel that would put it in? Because it's his word. In the coming days, it'll be a refuge. It's his word that you can put your hope and trust in. It's his word that you can flee to when you're in need of a strong tower. And you can trust in him and know that everything's going to be okay because you can ride out the storm because you're in a place of protection. So we find in that if we're one who's walking in his statutes, and even when other things are being judged, Even when we're in the midst of disaster and calamity, there's a place that we can flee for protection. We can be provided for because we understand all our hope and trust is in Him. We find that what's being emphasized here is that when you're walking in covenant, the reminder is always that no matter what your situation may be, you can understand and know that there is a provision for you. It's not about always being on the top of the mountain, because that's never going to happen. But it's about knowing that even when you're in the valley, even when you're in the shadow of death, that you can be at peace. You can have hope. You can know for a fact beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're going to make it out of there because you're walking in covenant. And He's promised you that there's a provision for you. He's promised you that there's blessings that He'll provide for you. And so we find that no matter what we go through, the fire has no power because we know in whom our hope and trust is in. Now, the first reference of this word hookah, statutes, is Genesis chapter 26, verse 5. It says, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, hookah, and my laws. When you go back and look at Genesis 26, you'll find that this passage is actually dealing with Isaac. It's dealing with a time in Isaac's life that there's a great famine that's coming upon the land. Well, isn't that interesting? Here we are talking about how these statutes are important in the midst of a calamity, in the midst of a disaster, that it's important for us to understand these and be walking these out. And when we read this chapter, the first time his statutes are spoken of is dealing with the time of famine. There's a famine in the land. There's some disaster that's taking place, and Isaac needs provision. And we find that he's instructed by Yahweh to go to a place named Gerar, and he's promised that he's going to be provided for because of the fact that Abraham kept the statutes. And so once again, we find that there's a pattern that seems to be being established in the midst of the famine, in the midst of the hard times, in the midst of the calamity. We're reminded there's a refuge, there's provision, and it's directly connected with one that would keep the statutes, one that would walk in this covenant. Let's look at this name, Gerar. He sent to Gerar in the midst of the famine. In Hebrew, it's translated as meaning a lodging place. But this name really doesn't do it justice. If you break down the roots of this word, you'll find that it comes from the root Gerar, which means to drag away, to chew the cud. It deals specifically with sounds that would issue from the throat, to ruminate on something, to bring up the food again through the throat, to eat it again. And when I saw that, I thought, that's interesting, isn't it? We're talking about a famine that's taking place. A time when there is no food, a time when food is scarce. And where is Isaac sent? To the place where he can chew on something, to the place where he can ruminate on something, to the place where there's some type of provision, there's some type of sustenance that seems as if it might be what's going to carry him through the hard times. It might be something that's going to carry him through the famine. Well, let's look at what he's about to chew on. The numerical value of the name of this place, Gerar, is 403. It's the same value as the phrase that can be found in Deuteronomy 8, chapter 8, verse 3, which says, by all that proceeds from the mouth of Yahweh. Al kol motzah pe Yahweh. It's funny because Yeshua makes the same statement, doesn't he? Man doesn't live by bread alone, but he lives by all that proceeds from the mouth of Yahweh. This becomes the clue. If you want to make it through the famine, this is what you need to understand. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but he lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of Yahweh. And we find what's happening here is Isaac's being reminded that, there's a famine going on and things look bleak, don't they? It looks as if you're not going to make it. It looks as if you're not going to survive this, but he's reminded, because there's been one that was obedient to keep the commandments, because you've been walking in covenant with me, I'm going to bring you to a place where you can ruminate on my word, where you can chew on my word, where you can be sustained on the word that comes forth from my mouth. And we find that this same promise goes forth for you and I as well. If we'll be one that'll walk in the statutes, if we'll be one that'll keep the commandments, walk in covenant with him, then there's a place for you and I as well. You can be one that can chew on his word. You can be sustained. You can survive in the midst of the famine because you understand who your source is. Now notice the definition of this word, though. It means to bring back up and eat again. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if I'm going to bring something back up and eat it again. That means at one point I had to already put it in, right? I can't bring something up if it's not there. And so it seems to be inferring that this is why he's telling you at the very beginning, put it in. Be a vessel, be a womb that will put my seed, my word within you. Carry my statutes, walk it out, have it written, inscribed upon your heart. Why? Because in the midst of the famine, you're going to need to bring it back up. You're going to need to have it within you to be able to sustain you. And if it's not there, then what are you going to live on? What are you going to be sustained on? And we find that if we've been willing to put it in, that even in the midst of the famine, when people are running to and fro, as Amos says, we've got it. And we can ruminate upon his word. We can eat it again. Now, this term gerar, if we continue to look, we find that it's connected to the word for cud itself, those animals that would chew the cud. It's the word gerah. It means cud, but it's closely related to another word, gerah. The only difference is the vowel points change, still the same Hebrew root letters. And this word means to cause strife, to stir up something, to contend, to meddle, to wage war, to provoke something. And it's used in connection with those who would forsake the law of Yahweh. And it seems as if it's describing some characteristics of an individual that has forsaken the law of Yahweh. If we're one that provokes, if we're one that meddles, if we're one that is constantly stirring up and causing strife, it's an indicator that there's been a disconnect. We're not in the boundary lines. We're not doing like we're supposed to. We're not one that is keeping the law. Instead, we're one that has forsaken it. Could it be then that whatever we ruminate on, whatever we're choosing to put in, whether it be his statutes or whether it be something else that we've been spending our time on, whether we've been causing strife, meddling, provoking others, waging war, that this then begins to determine how well we fare in the famine? You realize that whether we experience the blessings and are sustained or whether we experience the curses and lack, it becomes based upon our own obedience or disobedience. Whatever we choose to put in is what's going to sustain us. I can't be sustained off of what you put in. I have to be sustained off of what I put in. I can't hang on someone else's coattails in the midst of famine. I've got to know for myself that I made sure it was engraved. I've made sure I've walked this out. It's here. And because it's here, I know that no matter what happens, I can be sustained. I can be provided for, while others outside, there's strife, there's division, they're being provoked, being stirred up because they don't have this security, this provision. Now let's take a look at the word famine itself, because it seems that famine it's kind of important, isn't it? In fact, Abraham, there's a famine. Isaac, there's a famine. Jacob, there's a famine. The last days in the book of Amos, there's a famine. It seems as if this is something that Yahweh continually uses to judge and to reveal some things. The word famine in Hebrew is ra'ab. It's Strong's number 7458, and it means famine or hunger. But the interesting thing is that it's spelled resh, ayin, beit. Those same Hebrew letters form the term abar, ayin, beit, resh. Abar means to cross over. It's the root of where we get the term Hebrew. Could it be that it's in the midst of the famine that this is what births the Hebrews? This is what reveals those who are the Ivrit, like Abraham, those that have crossed over, those that are walking in covenant? It seems as if this is exactly what the famine does. It reveals the Hebrews. Why? Because it's in the midst of the calamity that it's the Hebrews that are the ones that can make it through. Because it's the Hebrews that were obedient in the first place to carry his word. It was the Hebrews in the first place that were obedient for his statutes to be written upon their hearts. So they have a refuge. So in the midst of the famine, you can look around and see the ones that are at peace, the ones that are somehow miraculously surviving, even though from all looks of it, they shouldn't be. That's a Hebrew, because they understand it's by every word that proceeds from the mouth of Yahweh that they're sustained, that they're provided for. That's their provision. You know, it's really funny because when we look around today, we find that among the body, there's a lot of folks that go around talking big talk, don't they? It's easy when times are good to say all that you've said we will do. It's easy when the famine isn't quite here yet to want to look the part of the Hebrew. We focus on the outward appearance. We do everything we can. We say the right words. We dress the right way. And we think we've made it. We're there. We've arrived. We're a Hebrew. And yet we find that it's when the famine happens that the real Hebrews will be exposed. We find that it's not about the outward appearance. It's not just about lip service, but beginning to inspect what's hidden in the heart. Is it there? Is it my statutes? Is it my word? If so, you'll find that in the midst of the shaking, the counterfeit will be exposed and separated from the genuine, the wheat from the tares, all in the midst of this shaking process. Now let's continue to look at this. Interesting to me because this Torah portion is the 33rd portion of the year. And some people may say, well, that's not important. It was divided by man. It has no merit on what's taking place here. But let's just look and see if maybe it does. 33 is connected to the promises of Yahweh. And this is exactly what we're dealing with, aren't we? His promise to provide for you, his promise to sustain you. It's also interesting because this is the 33rd portion, but it also happens that this first verse of this portion has 33 Hebrew letters. There it is again, 33 and 33. And so it seems to be emphasizing the fact that to walk in these statutes, that it has something to do, that this is the doorway. This is what will cause you to gain promises. This is how you cross over. The commandments gives us access to these promises. You go and look, you find the first time we see the number 33, chapter 46, verse 15. And at first glance, it doesn't look like it has anything to do with what we're talking about. It says, these be the sons of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob in Padan Aram, with his daughter Dinah. All souls of his sons and his daughters were 30 and 3. And if you don't look further, you'll completely disregard this. It doesn't seem important. And yet when you look, it's describing the census. It's describing accounting, basically, that's taking place in the house of Jacob as they prepare in the midst of a famine, go figure, to go to Egypt. We find that we're told that Leah's branch, the sons that she had, and then the children that they have, it numbers 33. Well, remember, 33rd portion, 33, the promises of Yahweh. What does this have to do with us keeping the commandments? What does this have to do with us being sustained and provided for? Well, this is important because here we find that the house of Jacob, it's a famine just like in the days of Isaac, but they're not sent to Gerar. Instead, they're sent to Egypt. In fact, we have to ask, what's the difference here? Why are they instead sent somewhere else? Why must they go to Egypt? Well, let's look at this a little bit further in the Hebrew. Let's look at the name Leah, first of all, because Leah is the one that's connected here with 33. Leah means weary. It's from the root la'ah, meaning to be weary, to be impatient, to be grieved, to be offended. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It describes an individual that's ruled and governed by their flesh, one that's easily offended. I don't like you. You get on my nerves. You did this to me, and now I'm just going to leave. One that's impatient, one that is just ruled and governed by their flesh. And notice as we go on that it specifically mentions the name Dinah as well in this verse. Dinah in Hebrew is translated as meaning judgment. So it seems that there's some connections here. We're talking about the coming judgments of Yahweh. We're talking about it being in the time of a famine. And here we have that in the midst of a famine, when Yahweh's beginning to judge the house, the one that's weary, the one that's governed by their flesh, the one that's easily offended and grieved and impatient, they got to go somewhere. But they're not going to Gerar. They're not going to the place where they're able to chew and ruminate on the word. Instead, they go to Egypt. But let's look at the place they leave. They're leaving Padan Aram. I want to focus on the second part of this name, Aram. It's translated as meaning exalted, but roots that are found in the word Armon, which means a citadel, a palace, a fortress. It refers to the innermost part, its highest and strongest part of the castle or the palace. So when we see this, if we plug in the definitions of these names, it literally declares that in the midst of the judgment, Dinah, the one who was ruled by her flesh, grieved, easily offended, impatient, weary, Leah, that she's made to leave the fortress, the safe place, the place of provision in the midst of the famine. Now that's a very sobering thought, isn't it? Because if we're quite honest, we all admitted earlier, we have a tendency to have issues with our flesh. We have a tendency to allow it to dictate to us. In fact, it seems like it's a constant struggle, isn't it? The minute you think you got a foothold on it, then it rises up, it gets resurrected. And so we find that he's reminding us this is why it's a daily walk. Walk, keep it, do it. Constantly cause these words to be engraved upon your heart, because when the famine comes, if you're an individual that's governed by your flesh, there will be no strong place for you. There'll be no fortress that you'll have access to because you failed to put it in. There'll be no safe haven. And yet when we look at this, Leah, we're told specifically that her branch, her descendants are 33. Well, 33 is connected with the promises of Yahweh. So we have to stop and ask a minute. Well, wait a minute. We're being reminded that even though she's been in her flesh, even though she's been weary, even though she's been easily offended, and even though she's being made to leave this place of protection, it seems as if there's still a reminder that there's a promise from Yahweh. There's still a reminder that there's a covenant that's been cut. She's still being reminded there's obviously something's about to happen. There's a chance that she's going to be given. Some of you ought to shout, hallelujah. Even though we've been here, there's still a chance. So we need to listen. What's the chance? What's the opportunity? Can we get back in? Can we make sure that we're provided for in the midst of this? Well, let's look. Leah and the whole house of Jacob, where are they sent? They're sent to Egypt, but specifically they're sent to Joseph. Joseph in Hebrew, Yosef, translates as meaning Yahweh has added. It means to add, to increase, to do again. It has the idea of a branch or a bow that's been cut off being added again, being grafted back in. In other words, the branch of Leah, the one that's been lopped off, the ones that's been discarded because of our own flesh, our own issues, choosing not to walk in the covenant. They're reminded that there's one that will add you back in. There's one that will graft you back in. He will do this again. In other words, he'll speak these words to you again. Once again, you can have an opportunity to walk in it, to keep it, to do it. You may have failed in the past, but here's another chance. In fact, the root of his name, the Samek Pei, it can mean a basin, a goblet, a cup, but it can also infer a threshold, a doorway. In other words, Leah, the one that's been impatient, easily grieved, ruled and governed by her flesh, she's brought to the threshold. Why is that important? Well, in ancient times, it was a common practice to use a door threshold to make a covenant between two people or two families. Whenever you crossed over the threshold, if you were a guest, you had just entered into covenant with whoever's household you entered into, and vice versa. They had entered into covenant with you. Now you begin to understand why it's so important that we're told to guard the gates. Guard the gateways of our mind. Guard the gates of our homes. Why? Because whoever we're allowing to come in, we're entering into covenant with. If we open that door and we let the enemy come in and he begins to wreak havoc, whose fault is it? It's ours. We entered into covenant with him. We allowed him to cross the threshold. And now we find that the fruit begins to change. We begin to experience this planted. And we find here that Leah, the house of Jacob, is being reminded that if they'll come to Joseph, there's a threshold covenant that's available for them. They can cross and once again be in covenant with Yahweh. They can choose to cross over to be a Hebrew. We find that the one who is governed by their flesh and had not kept the statutes is brought to the place where they can have a do-over. They can have access to the covenant blessings again if they'll choose to cross the covenant, cross the threshold, to cross over. We find that as a corporate group, when we look around, we understand that we've displayed the characteristics of Leah. It's not hard to see it. In fact, sometimes it doesn't take a lot for us to immediately become the characteristics of Leah. We find that we've been one that's been governed by our flesh, and really, we haven't always dealt with the circumcision of our heart. And because of this, in the past, we've been guilty of mishandling him. We attempted to mix and mingle this with our own flesh, not wanting to deal with it. And yet we find that he's made a promise. And it's because of that promise that we can still be given a chance, a do-over. Once again, an opportunity to get it right. We find that the famine can be a curse for some people, but on the other hand, it can be a blessing for you and I, because it's in the midst of the famine that we're reminded there's a threshold you can cross. There's a chance to make it right. There's a chance to once again have access to this, and you can cross over and become a Hebrew, become a vessel that will walk this out. In fact, towards the end of this chapter, in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 41 through 42, he begins to explain, because he knew we would do this. He knew we'd be here. And so he goes ahead and lets you know, when I've done all of this, when you've been expelled from the land, when the curses have come to their full, to the point that you're no longer even in the land, you've been cut off, just like Leah, just like the flesh, we've been cut off. He reminds us that while you're in this situation, when it comes to this point, if then their uncircumcised hearts will be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. In other words, you're never too far. Even when it seems as if you've been cut off and there's no chance, he reminds you, if you'll humble yourself, if you accept the fact that this has happened because you didn't walk in the statutes, then I'll remember you, and you can come back. You can cross the threshold. This word humbled here, it's Strong's number 3665, kana, and it means to be humbled, to be subdued, to be brought into subjection, to bow the knee, to submit before Yahweh. The interesting thing is that it has a numerical value of 140, and it's the same as that root of the name Joseph, the threshold. Do you realize we can't cross the threshold and say we're walking in covenant as long as we attempt to remain in our flesh and not circumcise our hearts? If we're stubborn, if we're prideful, if we're impatient, if we're easily offended, we won't make it across the threshold. We won't make it to this point. We find that the only way to cross is when we bow the knee, is when we're humbled, is when we choose to submit before the great King. It's when we choose to bring a proper offering and offer this as tribute, understanding that we're supposed to be a vessel that's housing this. In fact, in Mark chapter 12, verse 33, this is the words of the scribe, and I think he knew what he was talking about. It says, and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the soul and with all the strength, and to love his neighbor as himself is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. This is what he expects of us. This is what he requires. And so we find as we get ready to close that if we're obedient to allow his word to refine us, to purify us, to purge us, that in the coming days when the famine is raging and the heat's at full force and you're thrown into that fiery furnace, then you can ruminate on his word. You can have access to a safe haven, and you can know and be confident in the fact that there's a fourth man in the fire and going to remember me, no matter what I may be going through, no matter how bleak my situation may look, no matter what anyone else says, no matter what the enemy tells me. I know that he's much more than able, and he's going to remember and deliver me. Can you say amen?
It's really comforting to know that when you're in the midst of the fiery furnace that there's a fourth man. Huh? Amen. Wow. Now, this was a very